I'm Olivia Brooks. I'm a registered dietitian. I did post-secondary for a solid 11 years. Didn't have to be that long, but took the long route to becoming a dietitian. I did my master's. My research was focused on the impact that nutrition has in concussion recovery. Surprisingly, not a lot of research in that area right now, so definitely a growing field, but a very important field for sure.
One of the things that we talked about was that a lot of nutrition's focus in the world today, on social media, on YouTube and all these things, is on body composition. But we don't often talk about the impact of what goes into your mouth and into your stomach on your brain. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So despite only taking up about 2% of our total body weight, our brain's energy needs are extremely high. They need about 20% of our total body's total energy needs. So just knowing that alone, we want to make sure that we're well fed, and to be well fed includes balance, it includes timing, so making sure we're eating consistently. Having that variety means that we're getting nutrients like carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and those little micronutrients like our vitamins and minerals to kind of help sustain that those high energy needs and to make sure that our brain is working most efficiently.
So having said that, again, you go online, which most people do, and there's specific diets for specific things. Do we need to have anything more specific? Let's just talk about brain energy, and then we'll get into someone that's concussed or that's dealing with head injury.
Yeah, so in terms of like following a specific diet, I do usually recommend that we start by kind of meeting the basics first. So again, getting those whole grains or carbohydrate sources. Our brain's preferred source of energy is carbohydrates, so we want to make sure that we get those types of foods. Those can be our like breads, our pastas, our rices, starchy vegetables, things like that. Really important for our brains. Unsaturated types of fats, they can also have kind of an anti-inflammatory effect too. So those would be things like, or coming from food sources like avocados, nuts, fatty fish like salmon, things like that. And then protein sources, I think our brains immediately always go to meats. There are vegetarian sources of proteins as well too, but we want to try and get variety to make sure that we're getting all those little building block components of proteins as well. How did I answer your question?
Yeah, and something, so say somebody is in a post-concussive state. They've been diagnosed, they've got post-concussion syndrome. Are you going to give them anything different? Or maybe we had talked about a little bit, let's talk about the food, but then let's also talk about the social aspect around it and maybe some help that they may need in that state.
Yeah, absolutely. So when our brain is in recovery, its energy needs can increase. So again, consistency is really important, but then also not being afraid to ask for support. So it's one thing to tell someone with a brain injury, make sure you're eating, consistently every day, having balanced meals, but that can be a lot of work for somebody who's just kind of trying to cope with symptoms that are really overwhelming. So if you can find a time where you feel well to kind of take advantage and do a little bit of meal prep, a little bit of grocery shopping, but if you're not finding those breaks, to definitely rely on the people around you. So say, I need a little bit of support with grocery shopping, and they can help you write out a list, or maybe they can do the trip for you. But definitely not being afraid to ask for help, because cooking is a lot. We eat a lot of meals in a day. We need to eat a lot of meals in a day, and it really accumulates into being a lot of work that when you're feeling healthy and well, doesn't seem like a lot of work, but when your brain is trying to heal, it can get really overwhelming when you're dealing with symptoms, but then also trying to manage those symptoms with a balanced diet and consistent hydration.
So what are some tricks in there, like you talked about? Like, it is something that we do often. Yeah. You talked about, consistency in feeding. And in my experience, if there's no kind of preparation involved, that's when people, sneak into eating more junk and eating more fast food. Yeah. So what are some tricks, kind of like throughout the week if you're busy, like most people are, and especially with little kids, like how do you manage that?
Yeah, for sure. So I briefly mentioned this before, but if you can kind of come up or set a time, 10-15 minutes to kind of write out a plan. So if you're struggling with all meals of the day, okay, let's take 10 minutes and write out 5 to 6 breakfast ideas. It doesn't even have to be that many. It could be 2 to 3, and you can kind of alternate back and forth. And then in kind of your next window of feeling okay, you can do the same thing for lunch, you could do the same thing for dinner. If you're not finding that you even have that much time to do it, look online.
Yeah.
You can always look online for meal ideas, into your recipe books, things like that, and try to keep things as simple as you can for yourself. So maybe don't try new recipes, cooking techniques you haven't tried before. Kind of go to your tried and true. If you do need to rely on something like a meal delivery service, that's completely okay too. They take out that prep work for you. They give you the recipes. Things like that can be definitely very beneficial. Frozen meals, nothing wrong with those. The main thing we really want to do is make sure that brain is fed. So if it means making a little bit of an adaptation from your regular eating, meals and recipes, that's okay. We want to be fed and fueled, and then that can kind of trickle into being able to have the energy to do the more in-depth prep.
So you're saying too, I guess, like, a lot of people will shop for a week's worth of groceries, but making meal plans for a full week and then having them all in the fridge, that's kind of daunting. So maybe having like a 2 or 3 day plan where you can get that in. Okay,
absolutely. If you feel up to it and you kind of have that energy and even the support to do a week at a time, that's fantastic. But if you can really only get through a couple days at a time, that's okay too. Kind of do the best for what you can handle and what you can tolerate. And especially if you don't have supports around, or maybe can't afford a meal delivery service, that's okay. If it's just a few days at a time, that's better than nothing at all.
Yeah. You talk about energy. We need energy to live.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks who are maybe struggling to get their weight down, they think they're going to need less food. But one of the things that, and I've been a personal trainer for a long time. I coached athletes in the military. Is one of the things we talk. Well, you got to move, right? And it can be something as simple as walking every day.
Yeah.
But then you need fuel on top of that. So, typically and of course now we get back into, well, there's all these different types of fad meal plan. Like, what is just something basic someone can follow? The 3 squares a day with a couple snacks is like, right. Like, so what are you coaching people kind of as a baseline if they've just never even thought about it before?
Yeah. So honestly, I start off really simple. What does our balanced plate look like? So what are the components of the meals we want to include? And then what is going to be sustainable for that person? So for some people, that might be 2 meals a day and 3 snacks a day. For some people, that's 3 meals, 1 snack, or just 3 larger meals. It's very individual, but it's going to be about what can be sustained for the long period of time. Anybody can do a fad diet for 2-3 weeks, maybe even up to a year. But if it's not something you feel like you enjoy or want to maintain for the long run, then it's not for you.
Any major differences in gender when you're talking about that, like women's time of the month,
So kind of where you are in menstruation absolutely can have an effect on your appetite. Sometimes you're hungrier, sometimes you're not as hungry, sometimes we're more fatigued. So yeah, definitely there can be differences between like males and females, but again, aiming for that consistency and sustainability, and again, looking at the components of those balanced plates so that we're not only having the nutrients that our bodies need, but an enjoyable way as well. If you don't enjoy the way you eat, you're not going to continue eating that way. So not being afraid to have all types of foods.
So now we're talking a little bit about psychology here, and fat shaming, and women get this horribly online. We talked about Britney Spears had a little bit, and then of course she was shamed because she had a little bit of body fat on her. And of course men face this too. They see this idealized image of what a man should look like online, and it's this 23-year-old with ripped abs, and I'm like 53 going, I don't think I'm going to get those again. How do you have a very positive, jovial attitude towards this, but is this something that you face, and how do you manage that? Someone who's got an eating disorder, who just doesn't want to eat, or they have a very negative relationship with food. Like, how do you get into that?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it's definitely a big concern and a big issue just in the world of mental health. Eating disorders are the deadliest mental health disorder. It's quite scary, and it's even if someone doesn't have the full-blown diagnosis of an eating disorder, we see little tidbits of disordered eating through a wide variety of populations: males, females, athletes, non-athletes. So in my work, I really try to help people have a positive relationship with food in their bodies, and recognizing that that's different for everybody. Taking out the shame of eating, X, Y, and Z, because your food choices have nothing to do with who you are as a human being. You know, the nicest person in the world could have the quote least healthy diet, but we wouldn't know that because we interact with them in a different way that doesn't necessarily tell us what they eat. So again, just kind of really removing the shame, focusing on what we can add to our diets versus what we need to restrict. So unless there's, you know, a severe like allergy or maybe somebody's cholesterol is really high, we don't need to focus on like, you need to cut this and be restrictive and be, you know, mad at yourself for kind of breaking those rules. Focusing on how we can fill our days with positive, you know, food experiences and different foods, and then kind of make tweaks from there. But
so again, back to the basics. 3 squares a day, a couple snacks, whatever works for you.
Exactly.
Moving along maybe to something that's a little more advanced. You have a someone who doesn't have the psychological problem with food. You've got them on this consistent, you know, they're consistent, and now it's like, okay, they need to lean out a bit. They need to do this, they need to, there's an awful lot of talk about fasting and intermittent fasting. In my uneducated opinion, I think that's an advanced thing.
It's advanced,
it's very, right.
Sure,
but does that have a place, you know, after you've kind of nailed the basics, and does that have a place in your practice to put those things in there?
It can. It's very individual, and again, I come back to that sustainability piece too. So there is lots of research going into intermittent fasting and whether it is beneficial. Right now, the kind of conclusions we've drawn, which may change in a few months, who knows what comes out, is that when it comes to, if we're looking at it for the purpose of weight loss, it's not necessarily superior to kind of, again, just being mindful of total energy intake. So if someone's following intermittent fasting, there's a chance they're missing a meal, which then reduces the total amount of energy they take in a day, which could still technically be met if you followed kind of your regular eating pattern. So weight loss occurs when energy output is greater than energy intake, and whether intermittent fasting is superior to kind of just being mindful of overall energy intake, there's not one that's superior at this point. But
aren't calories more counted like over a week? Like one day you're off a bit, one day you gotta like, like, I know some people get crazy about every single day, but like how does that fit in? Are you looking at like a weekly caloric intake?
I think looking more at like a week at a time would give us kind of a greater picture. It's also really hard to just completely perfectly estimate somebody's total energy intake. It's hard to measure food intake. So say you were to watch what somebody ate for an entire week, they may change the way they eat because they know they're being watched. Self-reporting isn't always accurate. So it's never going to be a perfect science. It's kind of really challenging to gather all of that data. But again, sustainability. That's the main thing. So if someone's really perfected everything, if we look at what else is going on in their life, so like how they're doing as a whole person, how is their mental health? Are they hydrated? Are they moving regularly? Are they kind of taking in all those different components of health? Like what's their alcohol intake like? And if we've kind of really perfected those things, starting to kind of accept that our body just might look differently than somebody else's for doing the exact same thing. And that doesn't mean you're an unhealthy person. So there's so many different social determinants of health, and your outward appearance is only one factor of it. So it's a tough thing to work on in a society that places so much emphasis on how you look, but it's something really important to help maintain somebody's mental health as well too.
So now I think the most important question in all of this is how do you cheat? So you've gone to see you, I've got my meal plan. Do you say, look, try to create these good habits over the next 14 days and then reward yourself with a cheat meal? Or how do you factor that in, or is it different every time?
That's such a great question, and something that I work on with clients, and when I give talks and things like that, is making sure that you include those maybe less objectively nutritious foods regularly. As soon as we kind of put them on a pedestal, our desire and our need for them and our kind of control around them, it goes all over the place. So you think about not being able to have something, you want that 10 times more. So if you kind of keep that door open, you'll find that your control and your desire for that thing is a lot more contained, and you can have a little bit of that thing and feel satisfied because you know the option is always there. It's as soon as you're like, I can only have that so many days a week, that you're like, I cannot count down any faster towards that day. So kind of really removing that food from that pedestal, and knowing that the option is there, the desire decreases quite a bit. You're a lot more in tune with what your body's needs are. Yeah.
And what about like factoring in something like a healthy cheat? Instead of having a thing of ice cream, you can do, you know, some yogurt, some berries, maybe some chocolate chips in there. So, yeah, like just making it a little more healthier, but you're still getting that sweetness in there.
Yeah, I love that, honestly. Just, you know, it's kind of coming back to that nutrition by addition piece. So say you really want the ice cream. Ignoring that longer and longer and longer, your desire and your kind of control over having that bowl of ice cream goes from a bowl to the tub. But instead, okay, I want to have some ice cream, but how could I add a little bit more balance to that so that I'm not having like a spike and drop in my blood sugar? So adding something that contains fiber. So maybe that's some fruit along with it. Maybe that is half of it is Greek yogurt and half of it is the regular ice cream. So the Greek yogurt's going to provide a little bit more protein. So there's ways that you can include both things, and then thinking of, okay, how can I add to this to provide a more sustainable kind of energy?
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk on, and let's talk specifically about alcohol, but more on brain health. Someone who's struggling with either post-concussion or maybe someone that, you know, may be developing CTE because they've had long-term impacts.
Yeah.
How do you have that conversation?
Yeah, it can definitely be challenging if, you know, if someone's really struggling and maybe they've become dependent on alcohol. You would probably want to bring in like a mental health professional to kind of help with that like addiction piece for sure. But from my end as a dietitian, I would really try to encourage them to follow Health Canada's guidelines, which I believe has just been reduced from, I think it was 10 standard drinks for women and 15 for men, down to 2 per week. So trying to follow those guidelines the best that we can. Alcohol can sometimes displace other nutrients. So if we're focused mostly on, you know, having glasses of wine or beers or spirits or whatever, we might not get those other important nutrients that we need, may leave us feeling dehydrated. And then even on the kind of topic of dehydration, being mindful of caffeine intake as well too. So making sure that those things aren't displacing those important nutrients that our brains and our bodies need. So it might be kind of a multidisciplinary like healthcare approach to helping somebody who really is reliant on alcohol or even caffeine, but trying to encourage the guideline, following the guidelines, and then
So let's dive into the world of supplements.
Yes.
So we talked about earlier, supplements are good when you supplement an already healthy diet, but are there supplements out there, you know, that have good research that you recommend, you know, for since we're specifically talking about post-concussion or brain health, like are there things out there that can really help?
Yeah. So there is a lot of research into omega-3s. So omega-3s can be really beneficial for brain health and kind of the structure of our brain cells and reducing inflammation. So we try to get it from whole foods first, but I also understand maybe if your appetite is a little bit off post-concussion, you might not want fish. Fish can be really strong flavor, strong taste. Maybe you don't know how to cook it or it's a new food to you. With the help of a dietitian, a doctor, maybe even a pharmacist, kind of figuring out the dosing of omega-3. We don't have specific dosing guidelines for omega-3s yet, but that could be a supplement that we may want to introduce to help with it. Vitamin D, making sure that people have adequate levels of vitamin D. So in Canada, we're good right now to get some vitamin D exposure from the sun, but in the winter months especially, we can be quite low. So one, you could start by getting your vitamin D levels checked to see kind of where you're at with it, and then following up with supplementation if needed. Magnesium can be helpful. So magnesium is an important nutrient in the brain. So again, work individually with like your doctor, dietitian, to kind of see, are you getting enough from your food sources first? And if not, we supplement. So whole foods first, supplements second. Yeah, those could be some that are potentially helpful. Magnesium also can be helpful with sleep. Sleep can absolutely be disrupted post brain injury, so trying to get back into like a regular sleep pattern, some forms of magnesium can be really helpful with that too.
What about creatine? I've heard about positive effects on, of course, some people want to take 20 grams a day, but
that's high,
anywhere from 2.5 to 5 grams a day. Like, what are your thoughts on creatine?
Yeah, creatine's really emerging as kind of being a supplement that could be beneficial post concussion as well too. I don't believe exact dosing guidelines are developed yet, but I don't think the 20 grams, that's more of like if you're in a loading phase. For sure. But yeah, so creatine can sometimes be low in the brain post brain injury, so there's definitely some potential for a creatine supplement to come into play to kind of help with recovery as well too. But for, again, exact dosing guidelines, I would work one-on-one with someone and kind of see how much are they getting from food, how much can we supplement, and is there going to be a difference there?
Perfect. Let's talk about kids.
Yes.
A lot of kids are in sports and parents are like, what do I feed them? Again, these questions that come up again. Do they need something more specific? But at the same time, I think it's a good time to introduce some good food psychology too when they're young, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that can be a huge prevention tip for helping have that good relationship with food as they get older. Guidelines for parents have changed so much since I was a kid, since you were a kid. But yeah, for parents, consistency, exposing them to new foods, understanding that exposure to new foods or new things can take 15, 20 tries, trying to give them in different ways. So maybe it's a different shape, maybe it's in a different form, maybe it's somebody else feeding it to the child. So instead of the parents doing it, having grandparents or even a sibling help introduce something new. But yeah, so kind of just exposure to a wide variety of things. One of my favorite sayings is not to yuck somebody's yum. So even if the parents don't necessarily like it or the siblings don't like it, to really kind of reserve your opinions about the food to yourself, to just kind of really let people know that they're allowed to develop their own preferences and that we can.
And they seem to come and go, don't they, with kids?
Oh,
it's like
absolutely.
They love something and then they don't like it.
Yes,
and then
exactly. And that's okay. Preferences can change. Don't speak negatively about food. So what I mean by that is trying not to label foods as quote good or quote bad, because then again it becomes kind of tied to morality. So we have more objectively nutritious foods and we have less nutritious foods, and that's okay. There's places for both, but again, how can we add more of those objectively nutritious foods, still introduce our less objectively nutritious foods, and go from there. So there's a place for everything.
Another question I wanted to ask you, and this is kind of in the supplement role, but it's kind of more meal, because we're talking about protein powders. What are your thoughts on them? How often can you use them? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot of really well tested and regulated protein powders out there right now. I usually recommend for people to go onto Health Canada and make sure that there's a nutrition product number, to make sure that what is in the supplement is actually what's in the supplement. If something's not third-party tested, we can't technically say with confidence that this contains this protein XYZ. Maybe there's other trace minerals and things like that in there. So starting there, talking with a dietitian for sure. But yeah, protein powders can absolutely have a place in somebody's diet. Are they a necessity? Not always, but they can definitely be a convenient source of protein. So sometimes people just maybe aren't huge meat eaters, and that's okay. So we can kind of help supplement their total protein needs with a powder, and I have absolutely no problem with that. I think it can be really helpful. It's not a necessity, but it can definitely be a really useful tool if you're on the go or your preferences are different, but they can be helpful.
I know you talked about you don't want to label food as good or bad, but I'll just give you an example. I'm a label reader, right? So I go to the States and I pick up the ketchup and it's got high fructose corn syrup in it.
Of course.
So what are some things that you would recommend avoiding, for the most part? And when you're reading the label, there's a lot of talk on seed oils, and truthfully, in the last few years, they just seem to be everywhere now, these different seed oils. So without getting into that good and bad, like how do you get into some things that, hey, maybe you really should watch how much you eat of these things?
That's such a good question. So when it comes to kind of what to look for on labels, it'll depend on what the food is for sure. So we can be mindful of added sugars, so things that aren't naturally occurring in the substance already. We don't want to have huge amounts of added sugars. Depending on somebody's individual needs, we might also want to be mindful of saturated fats and trans fats as well. So we can have a little bit of saturated fats. Trans fats we kind of want to keep to the minimum. When it comes to seed oils and things like that, there's a lot of hype around it right now. We don't have any firm research to say that X amount is bad for you. So looking for, again, I kind of try to go for what do we want to include. So looking on labels for things like fiber, more unsaturated fats, protein content, and it'll depend on the food itself. You know, some foods you just aren't going to have a lot of protein, and that doesn't mean that's a food that you shouldn't have, but try to be mindful, or you can try to be mindful of added sugars, saturated trans fats, things like that can be kind of label reading tips that you look for.
And I guess what you're saying too before about having whole foods diet, sometimes you pick up a food and the label's 10 miles long.
Yeah.
That should probably tell you something about the food. I don't think there's a huge amount of label on a sack of potatoes or a bag of rice or a...
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, because if we were actually to put nutrition labels on, you know, fruits and vegetables, they would be surprisingly long. So the length of a label doesn't necessarily indicate that something is less nutritious. Right. Because we could really break things down into their like individual chemical components, and the list could get very long. So it's not inherently bad if something has a long ingredient list. We want to look at what the main ingredients are. So it's always labeled from highest quantity to lowest quantity. So what are the kind of the first few ingredients? Those are going to be the things that are most prominent in that product.
Right.
Yeah.
So being mindful of sugar, sodium
Yeah,
content.
exactly. Sodium, absolutely. Another one that we can be mindful of. We're usually pretty good at getting our sodium needs. It depends on the person. There's of course certain medical conditions where someone might need extra sodium, but generally speaking, we do okay getting sodium.
Perfect. On nutritional needs as you age, we're getting, obviously our population is getting much older.
Yes.
We talked about kids; they can kind of almost eat what they want. But as I'm seeing research now and people talking a lot more about as you age, you know, people in their 60s and 70s, that they really have to be very mindful of their protein. Or are you just taking the same approach? Kind of be mindful of your energy, eat, because that happens with elderly too, is they stop eating.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes and no. So our needs definitely change as we age. So sometimes parents get really concerned about, say, protein intake for children. It's not super high. Their needs aren't super high as children. Maintaining protein intake as we get older can definitely be very important to help maintain, our muscle health, our bone health, things like that. So needs absolutely do change, and I would want to meet or suggest like meeting one-on-one to kind of see where people are faltering. So sometimes your appetite decreases, sometimes it increases. It can be really individual, but needs absolutely do change kind of based on where you are in the life cycle.
Yeah, so it's not specific, but it does change.
Exactly. So the general recommendations of, having balance for sure still apply, but quantities of food may change, quantities of nutrients may get a little bit different, but they definitely can be different.
Okay, good. One of the things I talked about, especially in sport, is that damaged frontal lobe and that impulsivity. I guess this is kind of back to a mix of psychology, medical, and a mix of what you're doing and recommending. So have you come across that? Is there anything specific, or is that just back to the same stuff you're talking about with is that kind of an eating disorder that may need the help of a psychologist? Yeah,
if someone's struggling with kind of impulse control following a brain injury, it absolutely can affect their intake. So they might not be kind of slowing down to think, how can I make the most balanced decision here, and just kind of reaching for whatever is the most convenient. And maybe that convenient thing is only going to provide a short burst of energy. Maybe it's going to provide a longer lasting energy, but if someone's having a really hard time kind of controlling those quick decisions, balanced food choices aren't going to be, or potentially are not going to be, at the forefront of that person's mind. So if they're able to recognize that they're having a hard time with that, and then seeking help to help or seeking help to kind of make those decisions, or making or having more nutritious options the easy go-to choice. So again, that might involve a little bit of planning and preparation that you might need support for, but if you can kind of make that more objectively nutritious choice the easy choice, that could be really beneficial for someone who just wants to reach into the fridge and grab what's convenient.
And maybe get the pop and chips out of the house for a few days.
Yeah, exactly, right? Kind of just shift things around to make that more nutritious choice the easier choice.
Perfect. Someone who it just never ever really, nutrition's never really been a focus on them. They grew up, they ate what mom and dad fed them. They went off to university and they went to the meal hall. And they were playing sports and they didn't really think about all that much. And then they get to a point in their life where maybe they're not moving as much. They're gaining some weight and they're starting to feel, well, I need to make some changes in my life. What do you recommend that they do? Like, there's all kinds of apps, there's all kinds of things online. But you know, someone that's in Canada, like, where can they go to get this kind of help?
Absolutely. So maybe sounds biased coming from me, but absolutely going to registered dietitian. We are the only regulated health nutrition professionals in the country. So really looking for that title of registered dietitian. It can vary slightly by province, but here in Ontario, the RD title is what you're looking for. We are, again, regulated healthcare professionals, just like a doctor, a nurse, a physiotherapist. So we practice with evidence-based information in mind, and we really try to take a holistic view of the person. So not just what's going to work for right now, but what's going to work for the long run for you. We can take in medical history, family history, preferences, all things like that, and make it very individualized and customized for that person. There also doesn't necessarily have to be something, quote, wrong for someone to go see a registered dietitian. You know, like you just kind of described, somebody who needs a bit of a refresh. They've never had to think much about nutrition. Things just came naturally for them. A dietitian can be very helpful in that setting as well.
Yeah, kind of a reset. That's good. Is there anything that you want to talk about in your research that came out of your research that's significant in your mind, or maybe some things you'd like to see researched a little bit more in nutrition in reference to concussion and the brain health?
Yeah, so the big thing I was actually looking at was how many healthcare professionals are even mentioning nutrition as part of a concussion recovery. So it was a really small group. It was really kind of just looking in this London, Ontario area. But the little pieces we did draw is that there's not a lot of kind of referral to nutrition during concussion recovery. So I'd really love to see healthcare professionals in the field, so whether it be the doctors, the psychologists, physiotherapists, personal trainers, people who are working with people who have brain injuries, to refer to dietitians as well. So that was kind of a big takeaway that I gathered from my research, is that nutrition can absolutely play a role. I mean, we eat multiple times a day, every day of the week. Of course, nutrition is going to have a piece, so why not kind of refer to the expert in the area? So yeah, knowing that the resource is there.
And it's important because we talked about this earlier. There's people that I support through peer support and as a personal trainer that do have head injury, and they complain about brain fog.
Yeah.
And then they were like, well, how do we separate that? Is the brain fog coming from the head injury, or is it coming from their nutritional practices?
Absolutely.
So that's kind of, I guess, more of a recommendation, like you just said. Maybe it's time to stop and have a look at that if they're not focusing on their nutrition.
Absolutely, because it may be the component that's missing or that's a little bit off, but you don't know unless you explore that avenue. So explore the avenue. If it's still not helping with the brain fog, then we kind of explore different healthcare routes. But nutrition could be the component that's making a difference there.
Right. And finally, because Tim Fleischer wanted me to ask, can I still eat red meat?
Yes. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Try and look for the lean cuts, of course. I have to kind of give that nutrition piece
and balance,
there for
like
sure.
you said.
Exactly.
Balance
if red meat was the only thing you ate, I'd be concerned about your fiber. I would be, if they were, fattier cuts, I would maybe be concerned about your cholesterol levels.
Right.
But if you have things in moderation, you move your body, you drink your water, I'm not super concerned. So yes, Tim.
We have it on film.
Yes, Tim. He can have his red meat.